The Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant, Part 3, continued. Cassette 6, Side 2. Now and then a man rose above the fury to see life whole. If Hans Sachs had obeyed the magistrates of Nuremberg, he would have remained a shoemaker. For when, without securing the civic imprimatur, he published a rhyming history of the Tower of Babel, they suppressed the book, assured him that poetry was obviously not his line, and bade him stick to his last. Yet Hans had some rights, for he had passed through the usual stages to become a Meistersinger, and the anomaly of his being a cobbler and a poet fades when we note that the Guild of Weavers and Shoemakers to which he belonged regularly practiced choral song and gave public concerts thrice a year. For this guild, and at any other opportunity, Sachs wrote songs and plays as assiduously as if he were mouthing nails. We must think of him not as a great poet, but as a sane and cheerful voice in a century of hate. His basic interest was in simple people, not in geniuses. His plays were almost always about such people, and even God in these dramas is a benevolent commoner who talks like some parson of the neighborhood. While most writers peppered their pages with bitterness, vulgarity, or ribaldry, Hans portrayed and exalted the virtues of affection, duty, piety, marital fidelity, parental and filial love. His first published poems in 1516 proposed to promote the praise and glory of God, and to help his fellow creatures to a life of penitence. And this religious spirit warmed his writings to the end. He turned half the Bible into rhyme, using Luther's translation as a text. He saluted Luther as the Nightingale of Wittenberg, who would cleanse religion and restore morality. "Awake, awake, the day is near, and in the woods a song I hear. It is the glorious nightingale. Her music rings on hill and dale. The night falls into Occident, the day springs up in Orient. The dawn comes and sets alight the gloomy clouds of parting night." Now Sachs became the bard of the Reformation, satirizing the faults of Catholics with doggerel tenacity. He wrote plays about rascally monks and traced the origin of their tribe to the devil. He issued burlesques and farces which showed, for example, a priest seducing a girl or saying Mass while drunk. In 1558 he published A History in Rhyme of the Popess Joanna, a fable which most Protestant preachers accepted as history. But Hans satirized Lutherans too, denouncing their lives as scandalously contrary to their creed. "With your flesh-eating, your uproars, your abuse of priests, your quarreling, mocking, insulting, and all your other improper behavior, you Lutherans have brought the gospel into great contempt." He joined 100 others in mourning the commercialism and immorality of the age. All in all, and discounting Wagner's idealization, Hans Sachs may typify the bluff and crude but kindly German who, at least in the South, must have been in the majority. We picture him happy and melodious for 40 years in his home and his poetry. When his first wife died in 1560, he married, at 68, a pretty woman of 27, and survived even this trial. There is something to be said for an age and a city in which a cobbler could become a humanist, a poet, and a musician, acquire and use a large library, learn Greek literature and philosophy, write 6,000 poems, and live in reasonable health and happiness to die at the age of 82. 9. The Iberian Muse, 1515 to 1555. This was a lively time in the literature of Portugal. The exciting stimulus of the explorations, the spreading wealth of expanding commerce, the influence of Italy, the humanists at Coimbra and Lisbon, the patronage of a cultivated court, joined in an efflorescence that would soon culminate in the Lusiads of Camões in 1572. A merry battle raged between the Escola Vela, old school of Gil Vicente, who cherished native themes and forms, and Os Quinhentistas, the men of the 15th, our 16th century, who followed Sá de Miranda in enthusiasm for Italian and classic modes and styles. For 34 years, from 1502 to 1536, Gil Vicente, the Portuguese Shakespeare, dominated the theatre with his simple autos, or acts. The court smiled upon him and expected him to celebrate every royal event with a play. And when the king was quarreling with the Pope, Gilles was allowed to satirize the papacy with such freedom that Aleander, seeing one of Vicente's plays in Brussels, thought I was in mid-Saxony listening to Luther. The fertile dramatist wrote sometimes in Spanish, sometimes in Portuguese, sometimes in both, with scraps of Italian and French, church Latin and peasant slang thrown in. Often the action of the piece was interrupted, as in Shakespeare, with lyrics that crept into the hearts of the people. Like Shakespeare, Gilles was an actor as well as playwright. He was stage manager as well, and directed the settings. For good measure, he was one of the best goldsmiths of the age. In 1524, Francisco Sá de Miranda returned from a 6-year stay in Italy and brought with him the classical fever of the Renaissance. Like Ronsard and the Pléiades in France, like Spenser and Sidney in England, he proposed to dignify the national literature by modeling its subjects, meters, and style on classical lines. Like Joachim de Bellay, he included Petrarch among the classics and introduced the sonnet to his countrymen. Like Jodelle, he wrote the first classical tragedy in his native tongue, this in 1550. And he had already, in 1527, written the first Portuguese prose comedy in classic form. His friend, Bernardino Ribeiro, composed bucolic poetry in the style of Virgil, and lived a tragedy in the manner of Tasso. He made such a stir with his passion for a lady of the court that he was banished. He was forgiven and restored to royal favor, and died insane in 1552. A school of colorful historians recorded the triumphs of the explorers. Caspar Correa went out to India, rose to be one of Albuquerque's secretaries, denounced official corruption, and was murdered in Malacca in 1565. Amid this active life, he wrote in 8 volumes what he called a brief summary of the Portuguese conquest of India, full of the color of that expansive era. Oops. Now and then, a man rose above the fury on his Historia do Descobrimento e Conquista da India pelos Portugueses. João de Barros served in several administrative capacities at India House in Lisbon for 40 years, and disgraced his predecessors by amassing no fortune. He had access to all the archives and gathered them into a history which he called simply Asia, but which acquired the name of Decades, because 3 of its 4 huge volumes covered periods of some 10 years each. In order, accuracy, and clarity, it bears comparison with any contemporary historical composition, except the works of Machiavelli and Guicciardini. The proud nation would have rejected the exceptions, and gave Barros the title of the Portuguese Livy. The Castilian tongue had now become the literary language of Spain. Galician, Valencian, Catalonian, Andalusian dialects survived in the speech of the people, and Galician became Portuguese. But the use of Castilian as the language of state and church under Ferdinand, Isabella, and Jimenez gave that dialect an insuperable prestige, and from their time to ours its masculine sonority has carried the literature of Spain. An infatuation with language appeared in some writers of this age. Antonio de Guevara set an example of linguistic conceits and rhetorical flourishes, and the translation of his Reloj de Príncipes, Dial of Princes, from 1529, by Lord Berners, helped to mold the euphuism of John Lilly's euphues, and the silly wordplay of Shakespeare's early comedies. Spanish literature sang of love, religion, and war. The passion for romances of chivalry reached such a height that in 1555 the Cortes recommended that they be prohibited by law. Such a decree was actually issued in Spanish America. Had it been enforced in Spain, we might have missed Don Quixote. One of the romances spared by the curate in the purification of the knight's library was the Diana Enamorata of Jorge de Montemayor from 1542. It imitated the Arcadia from 1504 of the Spanish-Italian poet Sanazzaro, and was itself imitated by Sir Philip Sidney's Arcadia in 1590. Montemayor's prose and poetry romance was one of 1,000 instances of Italian influence on Spanish literature. Here again the conquered conquered the conquerors. Juan Boscan translated Castiglione's Cortigiano into prose quite worthy of the original, and accepted the suggestion of the Venetian poet Navigero to popularize the sonnet form in Spain. His friend Garcilaso de la Vega almost at once brought the form to perfection in Castilian. Like so many Spanish writers of this period, he came of high lineage. His father was ambassador of Ferdinand and Isabella at Rome. Born at Toledo in 1503, Garcilaso was dedicated early to arms. In 1532 he distinguished himself in the repulse of the Turks from Vienna. In 1535 he was twice severely wounded in the siege of Tunis. A few months later he shared in Charles V's feudal campaign in Provence. At Fréjus he volunteered to lead an attack upon an obstructive castle. He was the first to mount the wall. He received a blow on the head from which he died a few days later, aged 33. One of the 37 sonnets which he bequeathed to his friend Boscan struck a note that is echoed in every war. And now larger than ever lies the curse on this our time, and all that went before keeps altering its face from bad to worse. And each of us has felt the touch of war, war after war, and exile, dangers, fear, and each of us is weary to the core of seeing his own blood along a spear, and being alive because it missed its aim. Some folks have lost their goods and all their gear, and everything is gone, even the name of house and home and wife and memory. And what's the use of it? A little fame? The nation's thanks? A place in history? One day they'll write a book, and then we'll see. He could not see, but 1,000 books commemorated him fondly. Historians recorded his death among the leading events of the time. His poems were printed in handy volumes which were carried in the pockets of Spanish soldiers into a dozen lands. Spanish lutenists put his lyrics to music as madrigals for the vihuela, and dramatists turned his eclogues into plays. The Spanish drama marked time and could not know that it would soon rival the Elizabethan. One-act comedies, farcical satires, or episodes from popular romances were performed by strolling players in a public square or the corrale, yard, of an inn, sometimes at a princely seat or royal court. Lope de Rueda, who succeeded Gil Vicente as chief provider of autos for such troops, made his fame, and gave us a word, with his bobos, or clowns. Historians abounded. Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo was appointed historiographer of the New World by Charles V, and acquitted himself indifferently well with a voluminous and ill-ordered Historia General y Natural de las Indias Occidentales of 1535. During 40 years of residence in Spanish America, he grew rich from mining gold, and he resented the Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias from 1539, in which Bartolomé de las Casas exposed the merciless exploitation of native slave labor in the American mines. Las Casas sailed with Columbus in 1502, became Bishop of Chiapa in Mexico, and gave nearly all his life to the cause of the Indians. In memorials he addressed to the Spanish government, he described the rapidity with which the natives were dying under the arduous conditions of work imposed upon them by the settlers. The Indians had been accustomed by their warm climate and simple diet to only casual labor. They had not mined gold, but had been content to derive it from the surface of the earth or the beds of shallow streams, and used it only as an ornament. Las Casas calculated that the native population of the Indies had been reduced from 12 million, doubtless too high a guess, to 14,000 in 38 years. Dominican and Jesuit missionaries joined with Las Casas in protesting against Indian slavery, and Isabella repeatedly denounced it. Ferdinand and Jimenez prescribed semi-humane conditions for the conscription of Indian labor, but while these gentlemen were engrossed in European politics, their instructions for the treatment of the natives were mostly ignored. A minor debate concerned the conquest of Mexico. Francisco López de Gómara gave a very Cortesian account of that rape. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, in protest, composed, around 1568, his Historia Verdadera de la Conquista de la Nueva España, which, while giving due praise to Cortés, condemned him for taking all the honors and profits of the conquest, leaving little for such brave soldiers as Bernal. It is a fascinating book, full of the lust of action, the joy of victory, and honest amazement at the wealth and splendor of Aztec Mexico. When I beheld the scenes that were around me, I thought within myself that this was the garden of the world. And then he adds, all is destroyed. The most mature Spanish history, and the most famous Spanish novel of this period, have been attributed to the same man. Diego Hurtado de Mendoza was born at Granada some 11 years after its conquest by Ferdinand. His father had won laurels in the siege, and had been made governor of the city after its fall. Educated at Salamanca, Bologna, and Padua, Mendoza acquired a wide culture in Latin, Greek, and Arabic, in philosophy and law. He collected classic texts with the zeal of a Renaissance prince, and when Suleiman the Magnificent bade him name his reward for certain good offices he had performed for the Porte, he asked only for some Greek manuscripts. He rose to high place in the diplomatic service of Charles V at Venice, Rome, and the Council of Trent. Rebuked by Paul III for conveying some harsh message from Charles to the Pope, he answered with all the pride of a Spanish grandee, I am a cavalier, my father was one before me, and as such it is my duty to fulfill the commands of my royal master, without any fear of your holiness, so long as I observe due reverence to the Vice-Regent of Christ. I am minister to the King of Spain, safe as his representative even from your Holiness's displeasure. Recent research questions Mendoza's authorship of the first picaresque novel in European literature, The Life and Adventures of Lazarillo de Tormes. Though not printed till 1553, it had probably been written many years before. That a scion of a family only less noble than the king's should make a thief his hero would be startling. More so that a man originally intended for the priesthood should include in his story such sharp satires of the clergy that the Inquisition forbade any further printing of the book until it had been expurgated of all offense. Lazarillo is a waif who, as guide to a blind beggar, acquires the tricks of petty larceny and rises to higher crimes as servant to a priest, a friar, a chaplain, a bailiff, a seller of indulgences. Even the worldly wise young thief is impressed with some of the marvels arranged by the indulgence peddler in promoting his wares. I must confess that I, amongst many others, was deceived at the time, and thought my master a miracle of sanctity. This rollicking narrative set the gusto picaresco, or style of the rogue, in fiction. It evoked innumerable imitations, culminating in the most renowned of picaresque romances, the Gil Blas, written between 1715 and 1735, of Alain Le Sage. Exiled from the court of Philip II for drawing his sword in an argument, Mendoza retired to Granada, composed incidental verses too free to be printed during his lifetime, and recounted the Moorish revolt of 1568 to 1570 in an Historia de la Guerra de Granada, so impartial, so just to the Moors, that this too could not find a publisher, and saw print only in 1610, and then only in part. Mendoza took Sallust for his model, rivaled him, and stole a theme or two from Tacitus. But all in all, this was the first Spanish work that advanced beyond mere chronicle or propaganda to factual history interpreted with philosophical grasp and presented with literary art. Mendoza died in 1575, aged 72. He was one of the most complete personalities of a time rich in complete men. Always, in these hurried pages, conscience runs a race with time and warns the hurrying pen that, like the hasty traveler, it is but scratching surfaces. How many publishers, teachers, scholars, patrons, poets, romancers, and reckless rebels labored for half a century to produce the literature that here has been so narrowly confined, so many masterpieces unnamed, nations ignored, once immortal geniuses slighted with a line. It cannot be helped. The ink runs dry. And while it lasts, it must be enough if, from its scratches and splashes, some hazy picture unfolds of men and women resting awhile from theology and war, loving the forms of beauty as well as the mirages of truth and power, and building, carving, painting words until thought finds an art to clothe it, wisdom and music merge, and literature arises to let a nation speak, to let an age pour its spirit into a mold so fondly fashioned that time itself will cherish and carry it down through 1,000 catastrophes as an heirloom of the race. Chapter 36. Art in the Age of Holbein, 1517 to 1564. 1. Art, the Reformation, and the Renaissance. Art had to suffer from the Reformation, if only because Protestantism believed in the 10 Commandments. Had not the Lord God said, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." Exodus, chapter 20, verse 4. How was representative art possible after that sweeping prohibition? The Jews had obeyed and had passed by art. The Muslims had almost obeyed, had kept their art decorative, largely abstract, often representing things, rarely persons, never God. Protestantism, rediscovering the Old Testament, followed the Semitic line. Catholicism, whose Greco-Roman heritage had overshadowed its Judaic origin, had more and more ignored the veto. Gothic sculpture had fashioned saints and gods in stone. Italian painting had pictured the Bible story, and the Renaissance had quite forgotten the Second Commandment in a blooming riot of representative art. Perhaps that old interdict had been meant to ban representation for magical ends. And the patrons of art in Renaissance Italy had the good sense to override a primitive and now meaningless taboo. The Church, greatest patron of all, had employed the arts to form the letterless in the dogmas and legends of the faith. To the ecclesiastical statesmen who felt that myths were vital to morality, this use of art seemed reasonable. But when the myths, like purgatory, were manipulated to finance the extravagances and abuses of the Church, reformers forgivably rebelled against the painting and sculpture that inculcated the myths. In this matter, Luther was moderate, even if he had to revise the commandments. "I do not hold that the gospel should destroy all the arts, as certain superstitious folk believe. On the contrary, I would fain see all arts serving him who hath created them and given them to us. The law of Moses forbade only the image of God." In 1526 he called upon his adherents to assail the idolaters of the Roman Antichrist by means of painting. Even Calvin, whose followers were the most enthusiastic iconoclasts, gave a limited approval to images. "I am not so scrupulous as to judge that no images should be endured, but seeing that the art of painting and carving cometh from God, I require that the practice of art should be kept pure and lawful. Therefore men should not paint nor carve anything but such as can be seen with the eye." Reformers less human than Luther, less cautious than Calvin, preferred to outlaw religious painting and sculpture altogether, and to clear their churches of all ornament. Truth banished beauty as an infidel. In England, Scotland, Switzerland, and northern Germany, the destruction was wholesale and indiscriminate. In France, the Huguenots melted down the reliquaries, shrines, and other vessels found in the churches that came into their power. We should have to recapture the ardor of men risking their lives to reform religion before we could understand the angry passion that in moments of victory destroyed the images that had contributed to their subjection. The demolition was brutal and barbarous, but the guilt of it must be shared by the institution that had for centuries obstructed its own reform. Gothic art ended in this period, but the Reformation was only one cause of its demise. The reaction against the medieval church brought with it a distaste for the styles of architecture and ornament long associated with her. And yet Gothic was dying even before Luther spoke. It ailed in Catholic France as well as in rebellious Germany and England. It was consumed in its own flamboyance. And the Renaissance, as well as the Reformation, was fatal to Gothic. For the Renaissance came from Italy, which had never loved Gothic and had travestied it even in adopting it. And the Renaissance spread chiefly among educated people whose polite skepticism could not understand the enthusiastic faith of crusading and Gothic days. As the Reformation progressed, the Church herself, which had found in Gothic architecture her supreme artistic expression, was too impoverished by the loss of Britain, Germany, and Scandinavia, and the inroads made upon her revenues by Catholic kings, to finance art as lavishly as before, or to determine taste and style. Day by day, a secularizing, paganizing Renaissance asserted its classical predilections over the sacred traditions of medieval faith and form. Men impiously reached over pious and fearful centuries to grasp again the earth-loving, pleasure-loving passions of antiquity. War was declared against Gothic as the art of the barbarians who had destroyed imperial Rome. The conquered Romans came back to life, rebuilt their temples, exhumed the statues of their gods, and bade first Italy, then France and England to resume the art that had embodied the glory of Greece and the grandeur of Rome. The Renaissance conquered Gothic, and in France it conquered the Reformation. 2. The art of the French Renaissance. 1. A malady of building. In French ecclesiastical architecture, Gothic fought successfully for a reprieve. Some old cathedrals added fresh elements, necessarily Gothic. So Saint-Pierre completed its famous choir. Beauvais built its south transept, and Gothic made almost its expiring effort when Jean Vaste raised above that transept crossing a spire 500 feet high in 1553. When, on Ascension Day in 1573, that towering audacity collapsed into the ruined choir, the disaster symbolized the end of the noblest style in architectural history. Lesser Gothic splendors rose in this period at Pontoise, Coutances, and a dozen other cities of France. In Paris, where every glance reveals some marvel from a believing past, two handsome Gothic churches took form: Saint-Étienne-du-Mont, from 1492 to 1626, and Saint-Eustache, from 1532 to 1654. But Renaissance features stole into them. In Saint-Étienne, the magnificent stone screen overarching the choir. In Saint-Eustache, the compound pilasters and quasi-Corinthian capitals. The replacement of ecclesiastical Gothic with secular Renaissance architecture reflected the taste of Francis I and the humanistic emphasis on terrestrial pleasure rather than celestial hope. All the economic fruition, the aristocratic patronage, the pagan hedonism that had fed the fires of art in Renaissance Italy now nourished the devotion of architects, painters, sculptors, potters, and goldsmiths in France. Italian artists were brought in to mingle their skills and decorative motives with surviving Gothic forms. Not only in Paris, but at Fontainebleau, Moulins, Tours, Bourges, Angers, Lyon, Dijon, Avignon, and Aix-en-Provence, the brilliance of Italian design, the realism of Flemish painting, and the taste and bisexual grace of the French aristocracy combined to produce in France an art that challenged and inherited the Italian supremacy. At the head of the movement was a king who loved art with abandon and yet with discrimination. The light-hearted, smiling spirit of Francis I wrote itself into the architecture of the reign. Osez, he told his artists, dare, and he let them experiment as even Italy had not allowed. He recognized the Flemish power in portraiture, kept Jean Clouet as his court painter, commissioned portraits of himself and his entourage by Jos van Cleve. But in all the arts of refinement and decoration, it was Italy that inspired him. After his victory at Marignano in 1515, he visited Milan, Pavia, Bologna, and other Italian cities, and enviously studied their architecture, painting, and minor arts. Cellini quotes him as saying, "I well remember to have inspected all the best works, and by the greatest masters of all Italy." Probably the exaggeration is the ebullient Cellini's. Vasari notes in a dozen instances the purchase of Italian art by Francis I through agents in Rome, Florence, Venice, Milan. Through these efforts, Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Michelangelo's Leda, Bronzino's Venus and Cupid, Titian's Magdalene, and 1,000 vases, medals, drawings, statuettes, paintings, and tapestries crossed the Alps to end their travels in the Louvre. The enthusiastic monarch, if he could have had his way, would have imported all the best artists of Italy. Money was to be lavished temptingly. "I will choke you with gold," he promised Cellini. Benvenuto came and stayed intermittently between 1541 and 1545, long enough to confirm French goldsmithery in a tradition of exquisite design and technique. Domenico Barnabé Boccadoro had come to France under Charles VIII. Francis employed him to design a new Hôtel de Ville for Paris in 1532. Nearly a century passed before it was finished. The Commune of 1871 burned it down. It was rebuilt to Boccadoro's plan. Leonardo came in his old age in 1516. All the world of French art and pedigree worshipped him, but we know of no work done by him in France. Andrea del Sarto came in 1518 and soon fled. Giovanni Battista il Rosso was lured from Florence in 1530 and stayed in France till his suicide. Giulio Romano received urgent invitations but was charmed by Mantua. However, he sent his most brilliant assistant, Francesco Primaticcio, in 1532. Francesco Pellegrino came, and Giacomo de Vignola, and Niccolo dell'Abate, and Sebastiano Serlio, and perhaps a dozen more. At the same time, French artists were encouraged to go to Italy and study the palaces of Florence, Ferrara, and Milan, and the new St. Peter's rising in Rome. Not since the conquest of ancient Rome by Greek art and thought had there been so rich a transfusion of cultural blood. Native and Flemish artists resented the Italian seduction, and for half a century, between 1498 and 1545, the history of French architecture was a royal battle between a Gothic style affectionately rooted in the soil and Italian modes seeping into France in the wake of conquered conquerors. The struggle pictured itself in stone in the chateaux of the Loire. There, Gothic still had the upper hand, and Gallic master-masons dominated the design. A feudal castle within a protective moat, with fortress-like towers rising at the corners in majestic verticality, spacious mullioned windows to invite the sun, and sloping roofs to shed the snow, and dormer windows peering out like monocles from the roofs. But the Italian invaders were allowed to depress the pointed arch back into the older rounded form, to arrange the facades in tiers of rectangular windows buttressed with pilasters and crowned with pediments, and to decorate the interiors with classic columns, capitals, friezes, moldings, roundels, arabesques, and sculptured cornucopias of plants, flowers, fruits, animals, imperial busts, and mythical divinities. Theoretically, the two styles, Gothic and classical, were incongruous, their fusion by French discrimination and taste into a harmonious beauty shared in making France the Hellas of the modern world. A fever of building, une maladie de bâtir, a wondering general called it, now seized upon France, or Francis. To the old chateau at Blois, he added, between 1515 and 1519, for Queen Claude, a north wing whose architect was a Frenchman, Jacques Sourdeau, but whose style was quite Renaissance. Finding it inconvenient to build a stairway within the addition, Sourdeau designed one of the architectural cynosures of the age, an external spiral staircase rising in an octagonal tower through 3 stages to an elegant gallery projecting from the roof, each stage richly adorned with a sculptured balcony. After the death of his burdened queen, Francis turned his architectural passion to Chambord, 3 miles south of the Loire, 10 northeast of Blois. There the Dukes of Orléans had built a hunting lodge. Francis replaced this, between 1526 and 1544, with a predominantly Gothic chateau, so vast, with its 440 rooms and stables for 1,200 horses, that it required the labor of 1,800 workmen through 12 years. Its French designers made the north facade fascinating but confused with a maze of towers, lanterns, pinnacles, and sculptural ornament, and they distinguished the interior with a spiral staircase of great splendor, unique for a double passage that divided ascent from descent. Francis favored Chambord as a happy hunting ground. Here his court loved to gather with all its trappings, and here he spent the declining years of his life. Most of the interior ornament was destroyed by revolutionists in 1793 in belated revenge on royal extravagance. Another Franciscan palace, the Chateau of Madrid in the Bois de Boulogne, was adorned with a Majolica facade by Girolamo della Robbia, and was completely demolished in the Revolution. The extravagance was not confined to the king. Many of his aides treated themselves to palaces that still seem like importations from some fairy realm. One of the most perfect is Azay-le-Rideau, on an island in the Indre. Gilles Berthelot, who built it in 1521, was not for nothing treasurer of France. Thomas Boyer, receiver-general of taxes in Normandy, built Chenonceau, about 1513 and onward. Jean Cottereau, finance minister, rebuilt the chateau of Maintenon. Guillaume de Montmorency raised a lordly palace at Chantilly in 1530, another casualty of the Revolution. His son, Anne de Montmorency, Constable of France, erected the chateau of Écouen from 1531 to 1540 near Saint-Denis. The chateau of Villandry was restored by Jean le Breton, Secretary of State. Ussé was completed by Charles d'Espinay. Add to these the hôtels, or palaces, of Valençay, of Saint-Blancet at Tours, of Escoville at Caen, of Bernuy at Toulouse, of L'Allemant at Bourges, of Bourg-Taroud at Rouen, and 100 others, all products of this reckless reign, and we may judge the prosperity of the lords and the poverty of the people. Feeling inadequately housed, Francis decided to rebuild the chateau that Louis VII and Louis IX had erected at Fontainebleau. For this, said Cellini, was the spot in his kingdom that the king loved best. The donjon and the chapel were restored, the rest was torn down. And on the site, Gilles de Breton and Pierre Chambige raised in Renaissance style a congeries of palaces connected by a graceful Galerie de François Ier. The exterior was not attractive. Perhaps the king, like the merchant princes of Florence, thought a pretentious facade so near the city might draw an evil eye from the populace. He kept his aesthetic flair for the interior, and there he relied upon Italians raised in the decorative tradition of Raphael and Giulio Romano. For 10 years, from 1531 to 1541, Il Rosso, so named from his ruddy face, worked on the adornment of the gallery of Francis I. Vasari describes the artist, then 37, as a man of fine presence, grave and gracious speech, an accomplished musician, a well-versed philosopher, and an excellent architect as well as a sculptor and painter. Such were the undivided men of that expansive age. Rosso arranged the walls into 15 panels, each adorned in high Renaissance style. A base of carved and inlaid walnut wainscoting, a fresco of scenes from classical mythology or history, a rich surrounding of stucco decorations in statuary, shells, weapons, medallions, animal or human figures, garlands of fruit or flowers, and a ceiling of deeply coffered wood completed the effect of warm color, sensuous beauty, and careless delight. All this was quite to the king's taste. He gave Rosso a house in Paris and a pension of 1,400 livres, or about $35,000 a year. The artist, says Vasari, lived like a lord with his servants and horses, giving banquets to his friends. He gathered to his service 6 Italian and several French painters and sculptors, who formed the origin and nucleus of the School of Fontainebleau. At the height of his success and splendor, his Italian temper ended his career. He accused one of his aides, Francesco Pellegrino, of robbing him. Pellegrino, after suffering much torture, was found to be innocent. Rosso, in shame and remorse, swallowed poison and died in agony at the age of 46. This in 1541. Francis mourned him, but he had already found in Primaticcio an artist capable of continuing Rosso's work in the same style of voluptuous imagination. Primaticcio was a handsome youth of 27 when he reached France in 1532. The king soon recognized his versatile ability as architect, sculptor, and painter. He gave him a staff of assistants, a good salary, and later the revenues of an abbey. So the contributions of the faithful were transformed into art that would possibly have shocked the monks. Primaticcio made designs for the royal tapestry works, carved a masterly chimney-piece for Queen Eleonora's room at Fontainebleau, and repaid the Duchesse d'Étampes' patronage and protection by adorning her room in the chateau with paintings and stucco statuary. The paintings have died repeated deaths under restorations, but the statues remain in their glory. One stucco lady, raising her hands to a cornice, is among the fairest figures in French art. How could a king enamored of such demure shamelessness accept stern Calvinism in place of a church that smiled tolerantly upon these charming nudes? The demise of the royal satyr and the accession of the stern Henry II did not injure Primaticcio's status or Baudelarize his style. Now, from 1551 to 1556, aided by Philibert Delorme and Niccolò dell'Abate, he designed, painted, carved, and otherwise decorated the gallery of Henry II at Fontainebleau. Here, too, the paintings have been ruined, but the grace of the female statues is alluring, and the end wall is a stately splendor of classic elements. Still finer, we are told, for it was destroyed in 1738, was the Gallery of Ulysses, which Primaticcio and his company adorned with 161 subjects from the Odyssey. The Chateau of Fontainebleau marked the triumph of the classic style in France. Francis filled its halls with sculptures and objects of art bought for him in Italy and reinforcing the classic message by their excellence. Meanwhile, Sebastiano Serlio, who worked for a while at Fontainebleau, published his Opere di Architettura in 1548, which preached the Vitruvian classicism of his master Baldassare Petruzzi. It was at once translated into French by Jean Martin, who also translated Vitruvius in 1547. From the school of Fontainebleau, French artists trained under Rosso or Primaticcio scattered the classic norms and ideals through France, and these remained dominant there for centuries, along with the corresponding classic literary forms inaugurated by the Pléiade. Excited by Serlio and Vitruvius, French artists like Jacques du Cerceau, Jean Bouillon, and Delorme went to Italy to study the remains of Roman architecture, and returning wrote treatises formulating classic ideas. Like Ronsard and Du Bellay, they condemned medieval styles as barbarous and resolved to chasten matter into form. Through these men, their work and their books, the architect emerged as an artist distinct from the master mason and standing high in the social scale. Italian artists were no longer needed in French building, for France now went beyond Italy to ancient Rome itself for architectural inspiration and effected a superb synthesis of the classic orders with the traditions and climate of France. In this milieu of thought and art, the noblest civic building in France took form. Viewing the Louvre today from the left bank of the Seine, or standing in its majestic courts, or wandering day after day through this treasure house of the world, the spirit shrinks with awe at the immensity of the monument. If, in some universal devastation, only one building might be spared, we should choose this. Philip Augustus had raised its first form about 1191 as a fortress castle to guard Paris against invasion along the Seine. Charles V had added 2 new wings in 1357, with an external staircase that may have suggested the gem at Blois. Finding this medieval structure, half palace and half prison, inadequate for his residence and entertaining, Francis had it torn down and commissioned Pierre Lescaut, in 1546, to raise in its place a chateau fit for a French Renaissance king. When, a year later, Francis died, Henry II bade the enterprise go on. Lescaut was a noble and a priest, Sieur de Clagny, Abbé of Clermont, Canon of Notre-Dame, painter, sculptor, architect. It was he who designed the rude loft in the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, destroyed in 1745, and the palace that is now the Hôtel Carnavalet. In both of these tasks he enlisted the aid of his friend, Jean Goujon, for decorative sculpture. and when work on the new Louvre had made some progress, he called upon Goujon to come and adorn it. In 1548, Lescaut raised the western wing of the palaces that now enclose the Cour Carrée, or square court of the Louvre. The style of the Italian Renaissance dictated the façade from ground to roof, exclusively, as Rabelais might say. 3 tiers of rectangular windows, the tiers separated by marble cornices, the windows separated by classic columns. 3 porches, sustained by elegant classic pillars. Only the sloping roof was French, and there too the mouldings were of classic grace. The general aspect would have been too severe had not Goujon inserted statues in the niches of the porticos, and carved exquisite reliefs in the pediments and beneath the cornices, and crowned the central projection with the emblem of Henry and Diana. Within this Lescaut wing, Goujon built the Salle des Caryatides, 4 stately females upholding a gallery for musicians, and it was again Goujon who decorated the vault of the great staircase that led to the royal chamber where slept the kings of France from Henry IV to Louis XIV. The work on the Louvre continued under Charles IX, Henry IV, Louis XIII and XIV, Napoleon I and III, always faithful to the style set by Lescaut and Goujon. Until today, the spreading edifice is the congealed essence of 350 years of a civilization that ground the toil of the people into the splendors of art. Would the Louvre have been possible if the aristocracy had been just? For Henry II and Diane de Poitiers, Philibert Delorme created architectural Edens. As a youth, Philibert studied and measured the remains of classic Rome. He loved them, but back in France he announced that henceforth French architecture must be French. His spirit of classic idolatry and French patriotism was precisely the program of the Pléiade. He designed the horseshoe stairway in the Cour des Adieux at Fontainebleau, and the fireplace and coffered ceiling in the gallery of Henry II. For Diane he built at Anet between 1548 and 1553 a veritable city of palaces and formal gardens. There Cellini placed in a pediment his nymph of Fontainebleau, and Goujon surpassed the Florentine with his group of Diana and her stag. Most of this costly paradise has gone to ruin. An unimpressive gateway remains in the court of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. For the same triumphant mistress, Delorme completed Chenonceau, a little gift from her enamored king. It was Philip who conceived the idea of extending the palace across the Cher. When Catherine de Médicis took the chateau from Diane, Delorme continued to labor there till the masterpiece was complete. For a time his too mathematical style fell from favor, and he retired to write an encyclopedic treatise on architecture. In his old age he was called back to work by Catherine and designed for her a new palace, the Tuileries, between 1564 and 1570, which the Commune of 1871 destroyed. From all his patrons he received rich rewards. He became a priest and held several fruitful benefices. He died in 1570 as a canon of Notre Dame, and provided in his will for 2 illegitimate children. Jean Bouillon completed the brilliant trio of architects who adorned France in the reigns of Catherine's husband and sons. This book is continued on Cassette 7, Side 1.